You undergraduates? How many of you went to land grant colleges as undergraduates? This is a land grant college. So the rest of you are coming from arts and sciences backgrounds? So land grant colleges were founded for doing three things. What were they? Land grant colleges in America, 1800s. Previous universities were teaching lawyers and priests, liberal arts, all that sort of stuff, Latin and Greek, Hebrew. Land grant colleges were founded to work on things like agriculture. And in fact, this college was College of Agricultural and Mechanical Arts. In land grant college, we're given land here, build a college, here's some land from the government, and your job is to do three different things. One is what? What are they? You guys are graduates of land grant colleges, you know this on the top of your head. Teach students what we're doing here today, do research, what we do the rest of our time over in our labs, and bring the results of the research to people who could use it. It started with farming, mechanical arts. In those days for women, it was what we used to call home ec. So it was, cooking and preserving, cleaning, all that. That's the land grant college. We in Mānoa, we in CTAHR have our job split three ways. Tomoaki, what's your FTE split?
50% teaching, 50% research.
Yep, so he's typically half his job is teaching students, half his job is doing research. Me, 85% of my job is doing extension, which is bringing the knowledge and information, the educational programs for people who take care of forests, and 15% is research. So I do some research on it. So just a little bit of background on what I do in my position as extension forester, especially for people coming from the arts and sciences who don't really know what extension is. My co-author on this talk actually is my wife, Kathleen Friday. She's a program manager with the U.S. Forest Service and has done much more work in the other American Pacific Islands than I have, in Micronesia and Samoa and Marianas, places like that. Email's the best way to contact me. We have a website. I also have a photo gallery, and the photos show up on Instagram and stuff like that if you follow things on that. Tropical forestry in 2024, tropical agroforestry in 2024. Tropical is different than temperate, and 2024 is not 1500, it's not even 1900. Where are we going with this? So I was asked to talk a little bit about my own career path. My career path on this direction started when I was a senior in college, and I spent a winter quarter in Costa Rica. And we saw this beautiful tropical forest down to the, has anybody been to Costa Rica? Coastal, the lowland forest and huge jungles and full of jaguars and parrots and macaques and all kinds of things. And you go up to the edge of the forest and boom, it's all turned to ranches or banana plantations. There was the park, and after that, everything was devastating. Wow. What a mess. But there was one group of people that really inspired me. And this is a later photo. This photo is not from 1982. But they were at this research center, CTAHR, and they were working on something called agroforestry. And it really caught my eye. And what they were doing is saying, okay, what's the natural ecosystem here? It's a forest. It's full of all kinds of different plants and soil's covered and all this good stuff. And then we go whoosh, we make a cattle pasture, because that's what Westerners do, and ecologically it's a mess. And so what can we build a system that ecologically works more like a forest, but is productive agriculturally? So this is a coffee shade, and they have coffee, and they have several different kinds of, these are trees that they pollard for green manure, and the taller trees are trees that are growing for timber. So I mean, simple, it's a 3-species thing. These guys doing the agroforestry really interested me. So I said, I want to learn something about that. And since my undergraduate was in ecology, kind of liberal arts side, I went to forestry school on the forestry side and read up everything I could on agroforestry. I read every article in the first 4 issues of the journal Agroforestry Systems, because it just started coming out the year before I went to graduate school. And then I wanted to get a job, and I was told, look, you have 2 degrees, no experience, go join the Peace Corps and come back. And since I had done my work in Costa Rica and I spoke Spanish, the government sent me to the Philippines, where they don't speak Spanish. I thought they did, and then I got there and I thought, yeah, they don't. That was 75 years before, maybe, but not now, no. But anyway, assigned to an upland farm. I had a very classic Peace Corps experience, upland farming area. And one of the things we were to teach people, and this was a community of people who were fairly recent immigrants within the past 20 or 30 years to the area, cleared the forest, the slopes, horrible erosion going on like this, maize, sole crops, environmentally problematic. And we were taught this system called sloping agricultural land technology, which was hedgerows, like this photo's from 86. The last photo was from 85, 86, whatever. So it was hedgerows going across the slope, legume trees, prune it and mulch it, so you get some nitrogen fixation, you get some mulch on it and stopping erosion. This is down the island of Cebu, which Philippines are all. Cebu is one of the islands in the middle, quite crowded island, so hold on to that idea, very crowded. People have very small farms, so this is many families worth of farms on Cebu, but it was working really well in Cebu. And so we went back to our farm and we learned it and we started teaching it. And I had about 20 different farms contour their farms. Legume hedges, this is Glitter City here. These guys actually did a trial for me of several different, this was a mistake. This one went, it sees flowering and it went invasive, it started spreading. I killed every last one of those. I was like, I don't want to be the guy. And so I dug up and killed every last one of those. But the Glitter City worked really well, and it worked really well for soil conservation. And you see that Cipriano is a lot taller than Dorado, but you see how much it stopped the soil from eroding down the hill. So we left, we were happy with that. But when I went back, so this is 88, this is 2011, all those terrace areas were gone. Nobody was doing them. And the reason was, so I did courses in agricultural system at UH, because I went from Philippines back to Hawaii, or to Hawaii for my first time. And I started thinking more about farming systems. The sloping agricultural land technology, terracing with legume hedges, was a very labor-intensive farming system. It worked in Cebu because people had very little land and they had a lot of labor put in on that land, through all that cutting and all that mulching and stuff like that. My farmers had all the land they could open. They were not interested in spending more time. They were limited by their labor, and the labor-intensive system didn't work for them. And so a bunch of people tried it out and they worked hard on it and said, yeah, forget this. And about 10 years after that, I went out there, they just let it all grow up. They were cutting the trees for charcoal, and 20 years after come back and it's gone. But what they did was they developed a cyclical agroforestry system. Agroforestry systems, we think of them as either being sequential or cyclical. Not sequential, simultaneous. So simultaneous, you get trees and your crops growing at the same time. Sequential is you rotate. And what the farmers were doing now is they would plant out trees in a tree. What they would do, fire was a big issue. Every tree that we planted in the grasslands, because we were supposed to reforest the grasslands because the foresters do, every tree we planted burned, because the grasslands burnt every summer. But what the farmers, when they wanted to plant trees, what they did is they planted them inside between their corn in the cornfield. The cornfields they kept weeded, so it wouldn't burn, and they planted the trees. And after another year, they stepped back and let the trees grow. They could grow the trees for about 8 years and harvest them. And when they cut them back, then they grow, this is pumpkins here, and you see here's a stump, and they grow back. So they were able to do rotations of that. And so by having a cyclical rather than simultaneous system, you take care of some of the problem of plant competition, which we'll get back to that. But the other thing that really drove this was a market. There was a market for locally grown wood. In the 1980s, they were still whacking the big trees from the forest. So you'd go up in Isabella, right? I was in Isabella. The eastern half of the province was still forest. You'd see logging trucks coming down with like 3 logs on a truck, and they would be this diameter. So when you get logs like this for free, nobody's gonna want to grow trees. And that collapsed in the early 90s. That was it. They harvested everything they could harvest, is done. Then people were interested in buying trees, and the farmers are not stupid. They're like, oh, we can sell trees. Now we'll talk about planting trees. So they started planting trees. This is actually one of my friend's sons. He built a little mill right on the edge of the highway there. To this day, there's about 10 little mills right on the edge of the highway, and everything he's making is from locally grown wood. So there's a market change, and that changed people's behavior. So that's why they're interested in growing the trees. And then they developed this cyclical thing to stop the trees from burning, but not that much work for them. However, I thought that was a really good story. And I went back this year and checked it out. And so what I saw was this. Here's your cornfield and here's your woodlot. And I said, you guys cut and move them around over there? We don't do that anymore. It's too much work. We just keep the woodlot up on top of the hills, and then the maize, and then what you don't see is down here, there's rice paddy below it. You know, so the rice is what we eat, this is what we sell, and this is our money in the bank that we can harvest and sell later. And the landscape standing there, because you see it's hilly, but you see dozens and dozens of small woodlots scattered around with maize on the uplands, and then a little bit of area for rice in the base. I've been told how much I focus on plants. Once I got back from Southeast Asia, my kid said, "You have any interesting pictures, Dad, or just trees?" And so this is Conrado and Cipriano. These are the two guys that were in that 35 years ago by the hedgerow. So I was able to visit them this year when I went back on my sabbatical. They're a little bit older. Cipriano's a few years older than me. Conrado's a few years younger than me. But I was able to go out and look at them. That's a mahogany tree Conrado planted with us when we were planting some trees on his land. So I just want to have some people in my presentation. So there's two of my friends from the Philippines. My wife got the job with the Forest Service here. We moved to Hawaii. We made the deal. Whoever got the job first, okay. So she got the job here. I followed her here. I came over to Sherman Lab, met the chair, said, "Hey, I'm kind of interested in agroforestry." She's here. Come meet this guy. I met another professor. They said, "I have an assistantship opening up. You want to do a PhD?" I said, "Sure." So I did my PhD studying agroforestry, in particular how trees and crops compete. I did a whole study on nutrient cycling and it didn't work, and I did a whole second study on light and then it did work, and then I wrote it up and got a couple of papers and did my PhD on that. When I graduated, there was a job opening up. So I'm the first guy in 50 years to be an extension forester. CTAHR had an extension forester in the 1930s. I found some of his papers. It's really interesting, old home style tree farming in the 30s. But I'm the first one in anybody's living memory. And we moved to Hilo, we started out. And when I started, I had any opportunity to work in the American affiliated Pacific Islands. So my projects are not just in Hawaii, but the former trust territories of Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, the Northern Marianas, Guam, and Southern American Samoa. I've never worked, I sat down on Marshalls, I've never worked on Marshalls. But out there, seeing in some of these islands, and all the islands vary very much on how local versus how Western their agriculture is. Guam grows less of their food than we do. The local people, or at least a quarter of their land, is taken up by military bases, so they've lost a lot of their land to that, and just their culture is based on tourism and the military, and they buy their food in supermarkets even more than people in Hawaii do. Yap, there's a tiny little store, you call it a general store. You can see almost everybody on the island fishes or farms their own food. You know, the general store, there's just a little bit of food, and that's almost all that. So I got to learn a little about this. This is an agroforest in Palau. You see there's a betel nut. Most of you probably don't know what betel nut is. Betel nut it's a palm, it's a nut that you chew, and it's a mild stimulant, and it's like good old boys chewing tobacco in the South. Palauans, Yapis are going to be sitting there chewing betel nut. Chamorros, if they're more traditional, chewing betel nut all day long. So betel nut's a big part of it. And then this is Certosperma, so it's a different tower, but they have different towers and stuff like that. But the Palauans are largely growing their own food. Do I have Bill in this? I have Bill in this. Shoot, but I have Bill in this. This is one, oh, there's Bill. There's Bill. This is, no, if I'm looking at it from this angle. No, Bill was a graduate of our lab right before I started. And he did his master's. He was not a Peace Corps volunteer, he was a Jesuit volunteer with the Ag School in Pohnpei. And he said he got there, he was from the Midwest. After a little bit, he threw everything he knew about the agriculture out the window. And then he learned more about Pohnpeian agriculture than any Westerner at all. So he married in, he lived the rest of his life there in Pohnpei. And this is his farm, his backyard, but it's his family. So he married into a family that had all the land. But the point of the slide, he's a great guy. He ended up being chief of operations for Nature Conservancy Pacific, and then he passed away of cancer a few years ago, quite early. So walking around this forest, there's yams, there's different kinds of yams, there's betel nut, cassava, ilang, lots of kinds of bananas, papayas, just walking around looking at all the diversity of this forest. So one of the characteristics of the traditional Pacific Island forestry agroforestry is very high agrobiodiversity. This is just one page of different breadfruit cultivars. We were talking about bananas just now. This is Roni, orange and yellow flesh varieties for your health. Against diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers. You know, so the yellow carotenoid rich varieties of banana on Pohnpei, these are all the traditional varieties people have. Those islands have been inhabited, Micronesian islands have been inhabited something like 3,000 years. So very old cultures that have developed a lot of biodiversity to their agriculture. There you go. 4,000 years, Palau, dating back Palau, just showing you how old these cultures are. The Yap, if you ever get the chance to go to Palau or Yap, go. Yap, you can leave the road and set off on one of these stone paths and go back 500 years in 5 minutes of walking. That you really feel like you could have been back in this timeless kind of place. So it's based a lot though on a lot of these traditional knowledges, but it's not a dead culture. It's existing. It's Eric Walcook. Eric's one of the Pacific Islanders that was completely fluent in the Western terminology of everything, the different species and all the plants and subspecies and the varieties and all that, as well as being very familiar with cultural and traditional use of traditional cultures and just walking around. So, but it's not, so all the Pacific Island agroforestry have citrus in them. Citrus is a Western era introduction. They didn't have citrus before Westerners came, but they have citrus now. Eric was trying to introduce different kind of tree for firewood to stop people from cutting mangroves. So they're changing, they're adapting, they're living cultures, they're proceeding. Values, why do people do the agroforestry? Food production, subsistence. This is on Yap. We went to the Yap place, which is like their Merry Monarch, their big cultural dance festival. And they have you know, the FNET program here, the Expanded Food and Human Nutrition, part of the National Cooperative Extension thing. That's their, and this is their like their booth of their local food. You know, each woman brought in produce for the farm contest there. Yeah, so food and some of those islands, so I'd say Yap is growing almost all their own food. That's the most traditional of the islands. Pond Pig grows an awful lot of its own food. Palau is maybe half and half. Guam is 90+% brought in on it. But people are modern people, and people also want cash income. This is where the farms have to transition something, because the traditional one provided you your food, your medicinals, everything you wanted, but now people want to go to Las Vegas and they want to buy an iPhone, so they need money. One of the things they're doing in Yap is they're growing beetle nut commercial. So here's an agroforest, and this is the taro patch below it with the sort of sperma taro, but this is the agroforest full of beetle nuts. And beetle nuts valuable enough that if you pack 2 suitcases of beetle nuts, you pay for your trip back and forth to Guam to sell them to Micronesians, Guam, back and forth. So the Yapese are developing this commercial product with beetle nuts. We mentioned maintaining the diversity of different cultivars. Something about cultivars is that people don't keep growing them, they disappear. You know, so rare plants, if you don't disturb it, rare plants can just live in some valley and reproduce themselves. But if you have a cultivar of a breadfruit or a banana or a pandanus, the last person who knows this is different and this is why this is different dies. You know, Grandpa knew that, but our colleague Diane Rigoni has been documenting over her career how many cultivars do you know of breadfruit on your island over decades, and it decreases every survey she does. Fewer and fewer people know the different cultivars, so they disappear. So running an agroforestry keeps that knowledge going. Plus also just indigenous technical knowledge. How do you do things? Yams grow on trellises. Yams, I mean Dioscorea. Sorry, if you're from the mainland, people eat yams, which are yam on the mainland. That means something different. Dioscorea is the actual botanical tropical yams. That's what I mean. So yams, trellis, soil protection, and then of course watershed protection. The high islands in the Pacific, not the atolls are different, but the high islands that are mountains, like Pohnpei, I mean, this is true of Pohnpei, Yap, Samoa, have this coastal forest and a whole belt of agroforest, and then your upland forest. So ecologically, it's functioning like a forest. So here we are. We have this very diverse, and it's very knowledge intensive. You need to know a lot. Eric also passed away. The amount of knowledge he had of everything was just phenomenal. And a lot of that isn't being passed down, but it's also very labor intensive because it's not organized at all. It's all go by hand and machete. It's not done in rows or anything like that. And it's designed to do subsistence. It's designed to meet your needs for food and fiber and medicinals. It's not designed to pay your electrical bill. So how do we change this so these traditions keep on going? What I do want to talk about is agroforestry as a farming system, and I'm really distinguishing between farms and backyard gardens. And what I'm distinguishing is kind of, are you paying the people to do the work or not? Your backyard garden, so that's my daughter, and I made her go pick mountain apple in our backyard. That's my backyard. That's my backyard. So backyard garden, you don't pay labor. Sunday afternoon, I go putter around, I prune the trees, I gather some fruit, I'm happy doing that. It's not a commercial thing, but I eat fruit. Backyard gardens. This is so backyard gardens in the Pacific often include agroforestry elements to it. This is in a particularly urban area of Guam, and it's one of these community gardens where it's development of houses all tightly packed. And they've got a nonprofit got a chunk of a couple acres in the middle, and this is like one family plot in the community garden, and they've got some trees and some lemongrass and some other stuff growing there. So not backyard gardens, but if we're talking actual farms, how do we develop farming systems that use agroforestry but work in the American economy? So here's an example. This is a Crown Farm in Hilo. Actually, Noah Lincoln introduced me to this farmer. The trees are in rows. It's flat. You can drive between it. You can drive a sedan. Never mind, you can drive a tractor. So when you want to harvest your bananas, you still have to harvest it by hand, but you drop it in the trail. You're not hiking out with something over your shoulder. Anytime you have to walk out with something over your shoulder, you're not talking commercial farming anymore. You know, this is, and it's kept pruned, it's kept mechanized. Is it an agroforest? It's a coconut breadfruit mix versus just an orchard. That's semantics we can argue about. The other thing that I see of successful examples in Hawaii are things that are growing high value things. Cacao, coffee. I drink locally grown coffee, and it's expensive, but there's a market for it. People will buy the locally grown coffee. This tea plantation up a volcano, tea is really hard because I don't know if you've ever seen tea plants, what they are. It's a little thing, they keep them trimmed like that, and you just pick the top leaves off. So what you have in commercial tea production, you have some poor woman who makes $2 a day and just pick by hand and brings it all out by hand. There's no way, it's really hard to mechanize, so it's very expensive. So Hawaii grown tea is priced in dollars per gram for tea. But Lee, who owns this place, she's not selling dried bags of tea. This is a retreat with a meditation center. She's selling the experience of sitting there drinking a cup of local grown tea from the farm on your retreat in Volcano in Hawaii. You know, so the amount of value she's added to that tea allows her to do it. So it's part of the thing. And I mean, Ryan and I were talking about Kualoa, that part of they have agritourism visiting, and they visit an agroforest, so there's that value. So she's not trying to compete with Lipton on dollars per gram for tea. She's selling experience. Mamaki, I like this. This is a mamaki grown as for tea. Mamaki is a native shrub. It's one of the few native plants that's getting commercialized. It's a native shrub. It's a nettle. It's stingless nettle. It has a nice medicinal and tasty, sort of lemony kind of tea from the leaves. Shaka Tea was a company that kind of commercializes mamaki tea around. These guys are growing it, and it's in an agroforestry system because it's grown in patches like this size of this room, or maybe like 3 or 4 times the size of this room within an Ohia forest up there in Volcano. But in terms of pounds, dollars per pound, it's valuable. We did a study of coffee shade systems some years ago, and we looked at a number of different so coffee in Hawaii. The Kona coffee was traditionally grown full sun. Coffee in much of the world, like that one I showed you in Costa Rica, is grown under shade, but traditionally it's grown in full sun, partly because in Kona you get this afternoon cloudiness in the afternoon, and so it gives the plants a break. But there are those who grow it under shade. So this Island Sun is growing it under monkey pod shade. And so we did a study, and then we surveyed, we just had the ecology and the yield and all this sort of stuff. We just surveyed why the farmers are doing that, and none of them said for increased yield. It doesn't increase the yield of coffee, nothing on the flavor of the coffee. They have other reasons, like they thought the trees were healthier, they liked working in the shade, the workers liked working in the shade better. The trees could be if they had a Mackinac tree cup, it would be what do you call it? Sort of buffering the vagaries of the market if you had a different thing coming in. So they had a lot of reasons, none of which was maximizing things. Perhaps I think you might have been in the, I'm talking about the coffee shade project.
Oh, yeah.
You might have been in the previous slide here. This is back to Crown Farm. So this is modern day cacao. They're a city used as a shade for cacao. Again, This is run as a commercial farm. Simple, two components, a lot of light reaching the cow, so it's partial shade, but a lot of light, and everything is maintained. So you could run through and harvest. So the cow is fussy because there's no way you can rig a machine to go through and pick a cow. If any of you've seen a cow, it's these big pods, you have to hand pick them off and they all come ripe at different times, so it's a bunch of labor, but at least if you can drive your little gator or whatever down and just throw the stuff in the gator and drive it out, that helps.
Do they cut those trees back or is that just, they're young?
I think these are young, but I also think he will cut them back. Oh, so that's the mamaki I was showing you. And again, that's pruned, kept in rows, so you can do it. You're not wandering around the forest picking wild mamaki. I mean, you could do that, but that's not economic to do that. Another set of agroforestry systems, silvopasture, which is raising under trees. And it's been done a little bit, although I will say not successfully, in Hawaii. It's done in the South. In the South, what silvopasture is though, you got a pine plantation. And the pine plantation is driving it, and at some points in the life of the pine plantation, you let your neighbor graze his cows underneath it and then take the cows out again. What I see in the Northeast, and people are trying here, which I haven't seen done successfully yet, is add trees to a cattle pasture. Now that's hard because cattle will bust up the small trees, so it becomes very expensive for a tree to do that. And I don't know about that. You do see the negatives are damage to the trees, soil competition. The cost of fencing is really high on that for silvopastures. So this one was with coal, which I'm skeptical about. This one I like better. This is a small farm. It is fenced. They're going pheasant wood, which is a Senecio, and this is Mountain View with Big Island. And so they have sheep keeping the grass down. And once the tree's up, the sheep aren't going to bother it. Does anybody know why the donkey's there? Why is there a donkey? There's a reason for that donkey. It's not just, it is their pet, but it's not just because it's their pet.
Dogs away.
Protect the sheep. The donkey protects the sheep from the dogs. It's not feral dogs, just the neighbors let their dogs out, but dogs will form packs and will kill sheep. So the donkeys are mean. If they're mad, they can kill a dog. So the dogs stay away. So the donkeys protect the sheep. And this is another agroforestry system. This is Wong, Bernard Watson. He's the NRCS, like forester. They always take the prime farmer. They take him, but he's got a windbreak on his part of the thing. But it's a multi-species windbreak. So he's got Morongai here. Morongai is Morinda. Morongai. You guys know what Morongai is, right? Black books. What else is it called here?
Malangai?
Yeah, but when it's like the popular thing. Like Moringa powder is what they call it in health food stores. Moringa. Okay, anyway, that's that. That's this. So it's an edible product leaf, and then it's got the glare city in the background. I'm insisting that a botanical garden and a farm are different things, and both are good. But I think you have to decide what you're trying to do. When I see people doing demo agroforestry things, I think some people are confused and they say they're farming, but what they're doing is they're making a botanical garden. Now, this is Amy Greenwell Ethnobotanical Garden in Kona, and it is a botanical garden, but it is an area that was historically a breadfruit belt. The stone walls date to hundreds of years old. This has been farmed for hundreds of years with more or less these crops. I mean, you wouldn't see exactly, but you'd have seen these crops on this land 500 years ago in there, and it's a botanical garden. They do, I think they give away, but they sell some of the produce and stuff like that. But the point is, it's a place for people to visit. It's not, the breadfruit and the bananas don't pay for the cost of running the garden. They're not trying to. So they have clear objectives. And farms like Crown Farm, he's trying to make his living. He is making his living farming. He has a store that he makes and sells chocolate, stuff like that. He's farming, he's trying to produce something. Sometimes I feel like I see people who are making a botanical garden, but then saying, oh, I'm farming. And you're not farming cost effectively because you're recreating something like it would have been 500 years ago, but it's not efficient in today's economy. So this is a good thing. Botanical gardens are a good thing. Farms are a good thing. But I think we have to be clear on what we're doing and what is what. One of the things that I see is NRCS gives people grants and they put something in that will never be viable as a farm because they haven't put it together the way a farm is put together to be efficient. And when the grant is over, they're going to abandon it. That I don't think is good. I think if you want to make a botanical garden, fine, get a grant, make a botanical garden, figure out who you people are gonna visit, teach them stuff, that's good. And if you want to farm, you gotta be efficient, because labor, back to what we were talking about. Ancient culture, all you had was labor. Everything was very labor intensive. Modern cultural labor is the most expensive thing. You gotta be as efficient as you can with your labor use. The other thing that's really critical, this goes back to my original research, was trees play really badly with crops. Trees are greedy. Trees use up all the light, all the water, all the nutrients. I didn't even believe in allelopathy. I don't think trees like poisoning the soil, but I do think they use all the light and the water and nutrients. That's why I like this. This is our Milani station. And this is the sort of the back, but there's a row of trees here. And you see the corn up near the row until it gets to the middle. You know, so underground, this is really, the roots, I'm sure the trees are all the way underground. So when you're doing an agroforestry system, you really have to think about how am I gonna, but your valuable thing in a system like this, windbreak and corn, your valuable thing is corn. And if the trees take all the resources and you don't get yield of corn, that's not a good system, it's not working. So sometimes I talk about, does this agroforestry system work? When I talk about working, are you growing the stuff that you want to grow? Is it working to give you the goods and services you want? And sometimes it's not working. One of the things that I've seen a lot is putting so many plants into square foot or square, whatever, that nothing is going to produce. So this is a demo that I visited recently. And when I looked at it, I said, none of that is going to be productive because they put everything underneath everything else and nothing is going to get enough light to be productive. And I think one of the things and so I've seen this around in a bunch of demos. This is not something that a traditional, that guy actually happens to be plowing, but that's a different part of the story. It's not his farm. This was done by someone who learned agroforestry from a book. This was not done by a person who grew up working on dad's or uncle's or grandpa's farm. I saw this also in the Philippines when I was back recently. This was a very innovative farmer. He's trying all kinds of things. This was coffee underneath citrus. And the citrus is really dark. So there's these stems of coffee, not the leaves on them anymore because it's totally shaded out. And he's like, yeah, that didn't work, but he's tried a bunch of things. He had next to it, he had a really neat mahogany with rattan growing up underneath it, stand. So he had the understory rattan and then mahogany, Honduran mahogany stand above it. So he was doing good things too, but this one didn't work. I think one of the problems is that people look at diagrams like this and they say, oh, look, we can grow things underneath like 4 different canopies there. But the fact is that once you go through 3 or 4 canopies of trees, there's no more light. These diagrams are really popular, but what these stem back to is ecologists maybe in the 50s and 60s, first like doing botanical diagrams of the tropical forest and showing all these layers, and they were so enthralled by all this stuff. And then when they started visiting these agroforests, especially in places like Southeast Asia, they drew these similar diagrams and these cross sections. What the diagram doesn't show though, and the chart makes sense of how much sunlight, you're very low, it's still getting 40% sunlight, but that's not, this is showing much, much less than that. What this isn't showing is it's showing a row and then a gap and a row and a gap. It's not showing this, but what I see people is putting everything underneath it and it's not being productive for that. If you go and look at actual agroforests, so here we are back in Yap, your edible crop on the ground, which is taro and Yap, is in full sun in the middle of the day. So it's in a gap, it's not under trees, it's in a gap there. This is in Philippines, the same thing, there's a few taros there, but the taro's in a gap, it gets sunlight at least in the middle of the day, it's not under 3 or 4 years of trees. So the question for this then becomes, when is it better for your farming systems to just have your trees and a plantation over here and your crop out in the full sun here, or when do you want to put it together? Classically in agroforestry, when people try to figure this out, they just figured out a very simple equation for complementarity, and to figure out what that is if you had the yields separately side by side, you combine, you get more or less total yield. So if your tree crop is yielding 1, you got half of the tree crop here, and your understory crop here is yielding 1, half plus half. It yields the same when you do this, then it's the same. But if your crop you put underneath your trees doesn't yield anymore, then you only have half your yield. If it yields only half of what used to be in the shade. But if it's a shade tolerant crop that yields 3/4 of what it used to yield. So you get 3/4 of this yield plus half of this year, then you're 1.25 times doing it, if you follow. So that's something I think we have to think about. Does it really make sense to do agroforestry? And it's funny because when I started, agroforestry extension volunteer in the Philippines, agroforestry trainer for volunteers. Several years studying agroforestry, publishing in Science Agroforestry, got the extension job. Nobody asked me about agroforestry. People ask me about tree farms, people ask me about native forest silviculture, native forest conservation. Now I'm working on rapid geodeath. In the past 5 years, everybody's all of a sudden, after what I didn't hear much about for about 20 years, nobody's interested in agroforestry again. But I think we really have to ask this question, does it really make sense to do it? Or you always have the option of doing it separately and make those considerations. So how do we design systems that are efficient in an American or Western economics? Guam's got the same economics we do. How do we create knowledge because so much has been lost? How do we preserve what knowledge has been done? And how do we manage the tree crop competition if we're going to integrate these two things? So those are the things I think we need to figure out for agroforestry. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we'd like to take any questions from audience.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I was curious to know that even in the diagram that you show from Agroforestry Act,
Yep.
when we overlap the crops and the trees, even with the right management and pruning, cleaning, don't you think it's possible to have it like this?
Sure, but again, to be clear, what I'm saying is in this, and I didn't have room for these two things, if you look down above, there's a row of the green and a separate row of the blue, so they're not overlapping in space like that. They're in his design, they're separate rows. In this direction, it's spread out. But I think people look at this and think they're all right on top of each other, and then they will plant things like that. And that's not what Craig means for that. Now, to your other question, could you prune? Pruning is really expensive. You're back to, are we going to get ourselves on a treadmill? And this is the reason that my friends in my village in the Philippines didn't keep up the mulching, because it was so much work to prune and mulch the crops. You know, eventually they got a hold of commercial fertilizer. And if you actually have to physically carry green manure on your back to a field versus a little 16, you're going to do that. You don't want to get yourself in a situation where you're bankrupting yourself with the amount of work you got to do to keep something.
Thank you.
You spoke about a couple high value crops that have been seeing success here in Hawaii, like cacao, coffee, tea, and maki. What's the current state for either Iliahi or kava in agroforestry systems here?
Iliahi is, I can speak on more, kava, I don't know. My friends who drink a lot of kava bring it in from the South Pacific. Like they're Pacific Island, they bring it from their home islands. Iliahi is being grown in a mixed forest, but not in an agroforest system. So there are basically 3 operations in Kona growing sandalwood now, and some of our graduate students have been working on it. We had a presentation on that just today. It's grown in a mixed forest system, but not in an agroforestry system. Now, Pandu, who is describing it, talked about how sandalwood in other places is Vanuatu. I think he mentioned Vanuatu, and I know in Indonesia it's grown in an agroforestry system. There again, you have a different economics of cheap labor, a lot of cheap labor.
The concern, I would say, sandalwood in agroforestry in Hawaii, if someone would want to bring in Santalum album, put it in an old ag field and do an intensive, and apparently we don't want Santalum album because it can hybridize with the native. But
Yeah.
JB, years ago, it took me to a Santalum album plantation. It was on an old sugarcane field in Hawaii. And I don't know where that is now. That was literally 20 years ago. I don't know this fast.
So the what we call Indian sandalwood was actually from Indonesia, it's not from India, but that was planted in the 30s through the 50s, but mostly on Oahu and Kauai. So it is wild now on Oahu and Kauai and hybridized. So a lot of our native sandalwood you see on this island is hybridized with the Santalum album.
We don't know enough
From a
about
botany point of view.
our natives to even use them that well in agroforestry.
There is a question from online. IJB, what is the most compact yet productive agroforestry system that we have seen?
So I'm guessing what you mean is compact, like you can scale it down? I mean, I think any of the high value, so let me suggest this. The more high value your crop is, the more intensive you can be. So coffee, mamaki, tea, or all would be very high value compact. Silvopasture is much more extensive.
Thank you. You have a question? Yeah?
No, thanks to you. I have, like, your closing remarks and lingering on, especially speaking of like your whole, a lot of your career was an interest in agroforestry, and there's an increase in that interest now, just your thoughts on why that's.
Oh, why? Why?
Really?
I'm surprised, I'm surprised at it. Some of it in Hawaii is being driven by wanting to get back to what our ancestors did and that kind of thing. Which again, if that's your value and you're explicit about it and you're gonna say, I value growing my own food, even though it costs me, per calorie to grow taro versus eating rice from the store, that's a value as long as you think that through. So that's in Hawaii. But the nutritional aspect, which I know you've been involved with, that's one of the things, and I'm thinking more in like in Micronesia, the Western Pacific, as people switch from eating the yellow bananas and taros and breadfruit and sweet potatoes and yam and fish from the ocean to white rice and spam, people's health went like that. So that poster that I showed you from Island Foods in Ponte, I don't know if you worked on Micronesia, because I know you worked in the South Pacific, Fiji, but getting back to eating a local diet here in Hawaii, people heard about the Waianae diet. It came something, I think the Waianae gets back to the 70s, when did that start? Maybe later 80s. Anyway, Hawaiians of all the ethnic groups here tend to have poor health, especially Hawaiian people eat, the plate, the double plate, I mean, what I eat for lunch? I eat a hamburger steak on white rice, okay? Food like that, you eat too much of that, it's not good for you. A doctor in Waianae, Terry Shintani, said, you know what? When the first Westerners came, the Hawaiians were much healthier than the Westerners. Now that they're eating Spam and rice and Doritos and Pepsis, their health is that from all these diseases. Let's appeal to people's pride of their traditional foods and put together a healthy diet that people stick to, and we call it the Waianae diet, and became very popular here. You see that in some of the others, so that thing from Island Foods in Pohnpei is we're trying to promote more healthy diet coming from the agroforestry thing, as more people in all the islands get day jobs, and then they buy their food at a store, and they buy the cheapest food, and it's not the healthiest food. So part of that is the link to the nutrition thing, and I don't know if you all know, Rachel Novotny is one of our CTAHR faculty in nutrition, and she works across the Pacific in this whole thing, looking at the link between people's farming systems and the food they eat and their health. I know Rachel's been involved in that. So.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had experience like in that increased interest beyond what as well as like in the other kinds of kind of turning into some older practices.
Guam is. And like Pohnpei has never left. Pohnpei, it's more like, let's hold on to this, that what we have. Guam, there's definitely interest. One of the drivers on Guam is, so there's Chamorros and the native people of Guam, about a quarter, they're like Hawaiians here, about less than a quarter, about 20% of them. But there's Chamorro land trusts, and they can get 3 acres, but they have to cultivate it. And they have day jobs, and you can't put in 3 acres of beans and tomatoes and just do it every Saturday, right? But you could put in 3 acres of agroforest and just go out and do it on Saturdays. Have some bananas, some breadfruit, and some citrus, and go out and do that. So that's driving part of it. The other thing that was interesting in Guam, and I was sitting around the extension meeting, some of them I've known for a long time, last year at Cooperative Extension Office at University of Guam, and my friend Joe said, what you're not seeing is our festivals. He said, yeah, I work all day, I got 2 kids, I get home at 6 o'clock, I'm gonna put rice in the rice cooker and get some food on the table for the kids to do it. I have taro in the freezer, but I'm still not gonna cook taro for dinner on a busy weeknight. But our festivals, we want our food, we want our yams, we want our taro, we want the coconut to make the trip. So the food, the traditional food is important for that, and we wanna make sure we continue to produce it for that also. Because it's another one of the things leading into it. But the various islands are really very different all across, Rhode and the Marianas is much more self-sufficient than like Saipan, get it? And then, I'd say Yap is the most self-sufficient, Pointe, even American Samoa. When I was in American Samoa, I got the feeling that if the boats stopped coming, they'd shrug and go, well, it was good while it lasted, but we're back to the farm. Everybody's family has agroforestry. Yap, Pointe, Koshrai, Chuk, everybody's family at least has agroforest. You can always get some food from the garden. Whereas Guam, Hawaii, almost none of us.
Yeah, there's one comment and one question from online. Comment, great holistic assessment of agroforestry theory versus practice from Roland. We took them.
Roland,
Yes.
how today, Roland?
Yes. And question from Selina. Thanks for presentation. Is there a database of recommended agroforestry complementary plant association for Hawaii?
No, this is the sort of thing that it gets very complicated, even if you put two species together. And if you're going to try to do a multiple species, the ecological interactions are really complicated. I think what you need to do is just start thinking about for what you're going to prioritize, what are the tolerances and what's the shade tolerance, what's the moisture tolerance, and then start assembling things that will not ding up the things, so if you're gonna do something shade, you have a shade tolerant thing like coffee rather than, so shade tolerant different crops probably kind of available, and start looking at that. Drought tolerance is another thing. Agroforestry systems, novel agroforestry systems, which I mean, people at university designing and putting them on the land, in the dry tropics have not worked mostly. Because the trees are so fierce competitors for water. So mostly mixing trees and crops in a dry system, with a couple exceptions, hasn't worked. Whereas the wet tropics, it definitely can work.
There's another question came up from Leilani. What are some of the key takeaways that we could spread throughout the CTAHR about agroforestry so that we can get more people, Ohana community to incorporate?
I'm sorry, where was the person talking about?
Key takeaways.
No,
that
where?
we could spread.
In Hawaii?
Yeah, CTAHR.
Kailua, okay, so again, in Hawaii,
Or Waimea.
I would say, in Waimea.
Yeah.
So I would say, learn from farmers and ranchers what farming entails. So agroforestry, I see it as a more complicated way of farming. But I see people coming to agroforestry out of a community or a botany perspective, don't know anything about farming. You gotta be knowledgeable on the farm in order to do an even more complicated way of farming. So figure that out. So again, figure out the things like farming, marketing, efficiency of harvesting, efficiency of planting, and then figure out if you're gonna integrate trees and crops, make sure your trees don't outcompete your crops. Now, in Waimea on Hawaii Island, a lot of agroforestry, but it's windbreaks for ranches. So it's at this huge scale. Your crop is your grass, and you've got a row of eucalyptus, and you've got 500 yards, your next row of eucalyptus, and that is in terms of how many acres are in an agroforestry system. If you say pastures or windbreaks, that's agroforestry. That's by far the most of any agroforestry system in Hawaii now.